Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, surviving this heat. We are so excited to have you all with us. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books for Magic. We are so excited to have Megan Kamalei Kakimoto and Kira Mahealani Madden with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Megan's debut short story collection, Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. But before we get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Megan will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. Centered on the experiences of mixed Native Hawaiian and Japanese women, this collection dives headfirst into a sea of rage and grief, yearning and discovering myth and memory. In addition to having the best title and a gorgeous cover design, this debut has been hailed as, in the words of the great Elizabeth McCracken, a novel. Megan Kamalei Kakimoto is a Japanese and Kanaka Maoli writer from Honolulu, Hawaii. Her fiction has been featured in Greta, Conjunctions, Joyland, and elsewhere. She has been a finalist for the Keene Prize for Literature and has received support from the Rona Jaffe Foundation and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. She lives in Honolulu. As I mentioned earlier, Kira Mahealani Madden joins Megan in conversation tonight. Kira is a Chinese Kanaka Maoli writer, photographer, and amateur magician. She is the founding editor of No Tokens, a magazine of literature and art. Her debut memoir, Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, was a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Memoir, and is now in development as a feature film. Her debut novel, Whidbey, is forthcoming with Mariner HarperCollins. Winner of the 2021 Judith A. Markowitz Award, there is no period in her name. Okay, that is all from me. Without any further delay, please join me in giving Megan and Kira a very warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you all so much for being here. Can you all hear me okay? I'm bad at speaking into microphones. Okay. I'll just start. Thank you, first of all, Books Are Magic for having me, and Kira for being in conversation. It's such a pleasure and, such an honor. And thank you all so much again for coming and spending this evening with us. So I'll just start and read. I'm going to read just for a few minutes the opening pages of the story, Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. The first and only time she travels over the old Pali Road with a container of pork, Sadie smears blood on the back seat of her parents' car. It's well past midnight, and the stretch of Old Pali descends into darkness as they travel the bends of the mighty Ko'olaus. Sadie's stepfather, Lopaka, is behind the wheel. Her mother, Kahea, a skeletal squirm of a woman taking up space in the front seat. They are fleeing the rural shadows of Ka'ava for Palolo, where they have a cottage, an unkempt backyard, and civilization to confront. Light posts splash a weak gloss on the asphalt, and with only a few cars traveling the roads, Lopaka pressures the gas pedal, wedging himself into speed as a cat nestles in tight spaces. Sadie has just gotten her period for the first time. She uses the hem of her new dress as a rag to sop the blood. As they veer down the Pali, Lopaka rolls down the windows, gusts whistling old tunes through the old Nissan. Her mother's car, though Lopaka insists on driving. The wind flutters against the glass windows. Swaths of dark clouds migrate slowly over the ridgeline. The road steers around the Pali peaks, deprived of their pristine emerald sheen under the intensity of night. Sadie sees the seat drenched in the same darkness. She skims 2 fingers over the wet lip of her underwear and brings them to her nose, inhaling a whiff of blood so sharp she bears her head out the window. I'm going to die on the island's most haunted road, tearing over ancestor bones like they are nothing. Lopaka calls from the front seat, eyeing her horrified reflection in the rearview mirror. Hey, what you doing back there, girl? The car rolls down the Nu'uanu-Pali tunnel that braids through the ridgeline, weak yellowed light blinking through the dark just long enough for Sadie to see the blotches that have soaked the back seat, a deep bleeding through the otherwise gray nylon. I'm bleeding, she says, too quiet at first. The car rattles through the end of the tunnel, emerging onto the tree-lined highway. Lopaka says, say that again? And Kahea says, just let it go for now. And Lopaka snaps back, girl needs to learn for speak up. No one their bodies hurtling into the seatbelts, screeching. Someone is screeching. Steam skims the asphalt, choking the car's shell. The car's stops. Goes quiet. They all go quiet. Sadie peers through the kicked-up dust, scans the dark road, spies a creature the size of a cat, maybe? Or perhaps an overweight mongoose, something that snips and snarls, but to its core deeply fears you. She squints into the dark and sees a wild pua'a hunched low to the ground, its bristly tail and charcoal snout accentuated by the car's high beams, which Nkahea whispers, my God. And then Sadie draws a breath at the sheen of blood she senses on its black coat. She stares at her fingers, sees the same blood. Fucking rodent, Lopaka says, shifting the car back into drive and maneuvering around the wild boar bleeding or covered in blood or both. Hunting season can't come soon enough. But Sadie would like nothing more than to rescue every single pua'a, including the bleeding one, which she knows for certain her new step-family would ensnare instantly with their arcane muzzleloaders and hunting rifles. As the car propels forward, Sadie glances back at what she's just lost, a pua'a standing firm on its hindquarters, painted in ribbons of blooming burgundy, wagging its weedy tail like a pup that's been torn from its mother. She watches the pua'a until its outline bleeds into the stretch of haunted highway fading in their wake. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you all for being here, and your books are magic, as always. It is my greatest honor to be having this conversation with you. I'll try not to get emotional, though I often do, but having a conversation with a fellow Kanaka writer about these stories that are, I'm already crying. I mean, I'm also looking at my mom here in the audience, and it reminds me that when I first got your galley in the mail, the first thing I did was kind of run to her room, and I was like, you have to read this opening, which is a collection of Kanaka superstition as told by my mother, is the title. And it's this numbered list of these superstitions of Kanaka people, and I had just like, it just felt like such a warm welcome to the reader, to the Kanaka reader, and it actually leads to my first question in terms of your choice of like how to open this book in that way, because it does feel like this beautiful key, again, like a welcome to me, but also I would imagine many readers would return to it to kind of revisit the internal logic of each story, which is so based in Molelo, Hawaii, and superstition, and it's just so fun to return to them. And we laughed so hard just seeing it in print and having this point of connection to these stories that so many of us grew up with.
Yeah. So that story actually, the draft originated from a writing prompt from my first year seminar instructor, Maya Perez, who's amazing. And it was my first year of my MFA, and I think I forget what the exact prompt was exactly, but it was this idea of like writing into the list form and the list format. And I know this was like 3-ish years ago, and I had a strong sense that I wanted to use the time that the MFA had afforded me to really focus on writing into these ancestral stories that I had been sort of experimenting with and thinking about my whole life, and couldn't really figure out how I wanted to see it into fiction and what that was going to look like. And I think that prompt itself really offered me the opportunity to kind of just compile all of these superstitions, and a lot of them rooted in Hawaiian mo'olelo, in our stories, our mythology, and our legends, and seeing the way that these superstitions started to slowly like impress themselves on the lives of the story's characters was really kind of fun for me to play around with. And also it was a really, I think, enjoyable idea to start the book with just like a list of negations or a list of warnings and don'ts, and then to move straight into a story that the excerpt that I just read from Every Drop is the second story, and moving straight into one that is immediately a character who defies one of the biggest kind of warnings in our culture, I thought was really enjoyable.
You have a few of those.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't going to go here so soon, but on the topic of don'ts, I really wanted to talk about this concept of kapu. It's something that you've written about in the collection, and in this beautiful essay I encourage you all to read in LitHub about the writing of this collection and Kanaka literature, and Kanaka, Hawaiian, or Pacific literature not being a monolith. Thank you so much for that. Taught me so much, as always. But this concept of kapu, which when I was a kid, I saw this sign on like hotel doors, so I thought that it meant privacy or something. And when I grew up, I learned the real meanings of like kind of stay out or sacred, or like what that word could mean or what it could carry. And I was thinking about this story, Aiko, the writer in this book, which is a really funny and terrifying story about a writer who kind of carries this fear of what is off limits to write about in terms of mo'olelo and Hawaiian mythology and certain characters within that mythology, and what kind of curses us by committing it to the page. So I'm curious, I'm so curious about that story because I love it so much. It's creepy, it's funny, it's a manuscript is kind of haunting its writer, so that might resonate with a few of us. But in terms of how you kind of held this idea of like fear, or what we can or should not write about, what strips something of life versus what gives something life and power, how did you wrestle with that, and how did you approach it, maybe in that story or in the collection as a whole, or as a person?
Yeah, I love that question. I also love that you mentioned kapu signs on doors in the hotel. When I was a kid, my family grew up in Waikane Valley on the windward side of Oahu, and they had a lot of signs that said kapu, keep out. And when I was a kid, I thought that kapu was a person that they were telling someone to keep out. And I asked my grams, like, who's kapu and why don't they like him? And my family still makes fun of me for about that to this day. But I think, that's, I honestly think that writing about things that are kapu, or even just dealing with topics that are, in the direct translation would be sort of taboo or off limits, is probably something I'm still wrestling with, and will probably just constantly be wrestling with. And I think that just goes back to the fact that so many of our ancestral stories are incredibly sacred, and we don't necessarily, a lot of, I think, talking about the superstitions, some of them might sound really silly to a lot of readers, or it might not make a lot of sense, but I think when the superstitions themselves are rooted in such important Hawaiian mythology and mo'olelo, that it was important for me to really treat them as such, to treat them with respect and almost kind of be protective of them. So I think that was one of the challenges in writing a lot of the first drafts, was encountering like, how do I protect these stories, but also, knowing that they're capacious enough to like welcome readers in and invite readers in. And I think that just a lot of drafts, like writing a first draft and then starting again and trying to write another draft until it felt like the truest version of itself, where I felt, where I guess felt like I was telling my truth, was I guess the only point that I could, that was the point where I felt confident in sharing the stories. But I feel like it took a long time to build up that confidence.
Yeah. And I love that you use that word capacious too, because I think in that essay you talked about Hawaiian literature in that way too, that like we are people capacious enough to see not only where we are, but where we can go, where the future of this literature can go, should it be platformed more in the world.
Definitely.
So it made me feel like I want to be a braver writer, and I just appreciate that so much.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about this story. All these stories, again, they're spooky, they're sexy, they're terrifying. Everyone I've talked to who's read the book, not this notebook, this book, has said that when they're not reading your book, they're having dreams about it or they're thinking about it nonstop. And I feel that way too. And I'm curious, like, there's so many characters here who are being possessed or haunted. Haunted by figures, haunted by their own selves or past selves, or their own fears. And I'm curious for you as a writer in general, how does that relate to you as a writer in your characters as you're crafting your own stories? We were lucky enough to have dinner last week in Hawaii, and I was asking about your favorite story, and you talked about Corpse Flower and how the characters kind of just like appeared or came to you. And I wanted to know so much more about like how, in terms of your process, how do they appear? How do they surprise you? Your endings are so surprising. Like, I don't know, your connection to that idea of a ghost speaking or possession of character.
Yeah, I think character for me is a lot of the ways that, not necessarily the way that a story begins for me, but that I'm able to sort of, it's not necessarily the first thing that comes, but it's the thing that I feel like opens the story up for me in a way to be able to explore it fully. So writing into characters and like making the space for characters to sort of surprise me with their choices, or a lot of times the bad decisions that they make, is one of the most delightful parts, I think, for me of writing a draft, and especially a first draft. And on the side of the hauntings, like that, I don't think I necessarily set out writing, like intending to write so many stories where characters are either being haunted or are haunting other characters. And I truly think it was kind of allowing a character move in space and seeing what pops up, and that started just popping up a lot. And I feel like I've had to learn that a lot of my process is sort of following those impulses when things kind of start to appear and reappear in my writing, and paying attention to that, because that's sort of that's where the heat is, and where I can really follow like a narrative and a character's trajectory. I think in my own life, my family, and I think we all very much believe in ghosts. We believe in sort of ancestral spirits, and there's, a lot of, again, kind of responsibility there, especially in Hawaiian culture and also in Japanese culture, in terms of treating those who have passed with respect. And I think when I was a kid, that used to really scare me a lot. And, growing up, I realized that a lot of the things that I love writing about are actually the things that most terrify me, because it gives me a chance to like
explore the fear almost in a safer space, if that makes sense.
That was maybe the first laugh I had on page 1 or 2 of the book, that our kupuna, our ancestors, are like the bugs or the lizards. And when I was a kid, you go to swat something and my mom or grandma, that's your grandfather. And that's in page 1, we know what we're in for, and it certainly comes back again and again in this amazing book. Something I wrote down here instead of a full question was just blood, which I already asked you about at dinner. So this book has a lot of blood, right? It has the best title of all titles ever, Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. We have this amazing cover. You all heard the excerpt from that amazing piece about the Pali and blood, in which blood plays a major factor. And it comes through in all sorts of ways. The book also closes with some blood imagery. So we're at dinner last week and I say, Megan, tell me about the blood. And she says, I actually didn't notice until someone pointed it out to me that it appears in every story. So on that note, I'm curious, tell me about the blood. And also, I'm sure many people in this room, myself included, write stories. And how did the collection start to become a collection with such a tight vision and theme and mood and this beautiful cover? How many stories went into this number of stories?
Yeah. So yes, first I actually didn't notice, but there were the sort of overt blood themes or interests that I was interested in writing about. Menstruation was always one of them, and sort of exploring my own fraught relationship with menstruation in fiction, what that looks like. I knew from the start that I wanted to write stories that championed, Native Hawaiian ancestry, Native Hawaiian blood, what that looks like, and sort of also looking at the way that, Hawaii is a land. It's not bleeding in the way, we maybe the way that a human bleeds, but I think there's been so much violence from colonialism that has impacted our land, that I think that there's the wounds there that are also very prevalent and that I was thinking about a lot. So when I started to notice those threads, when people pointed it out to me, I was thinking a lot about just the way that stories fit in. A great deal of editorial work with my amazing agent Ivalani, and then a lot more with my amazing editor Kelly. Both of them are here today, and also try not to cry. But I had two of the most incredible readers to sort of guide the creation of this collection, and having an awareness of that a lot of stories that I had imagined going into this collection did not make it, and thinking in terms of how to fit the stories that I wanted to tell and the stories that felt right for this book. I think it was just a lot of really following those threads and trying to see how they really spoke to each other in the different stories. I learned a lot about the way that organizing a collection, the way that how one story ends and another begins, you can create a sense of continuity. You can also create a sort of a brushing up against each other or some tension. And I think with a lot of time and attention to the way that stories were speaking to each other, I think that went into the process as well.
That's beautiful. Wow. I'm just checking time real quick.
Yeah.
Do you have the time, Megan? My phone is, of course, not working now.
7:32.
Okay. We're going to open up for Q&A shortly, so think about those questions. You mentioned endings, and I did want to ask you about endings, and I know you're also a fan of Joy Williams. And as I was reading this collection, I was thinking of her stories, how the endings always feel like these wild departures, out of left field, these side steps that take you to a new place or a new emotional landscape entirely. They're so surprising. And as a writer who just really wants to learn from you, and Megan does teach as well, tell me about your endings. How do you arrive at them? Do they come first and maybe there's something you build towards, or is that part of the surprise of your characters kind of speaking to you?
Yeah, I think endings have always actually been one of the most challenging things for me to write, but I think it was because I was really fighting what maybe the natural progression of the story. I felt like going, when I was first starting to write short stories especially, I often started with an ending and was like, oh, I have an image or like a really, profound scene that I want to really just land on and sort of write backwards from there. And it was it did not work. That's not how it worked for me. I felt like so much of the joy that I've found in writing short stories, especially for this collection, has been in the surprise and in getting to know, again, I guess returning to character, letting these, the majority of the protagonists in this collection are all women, and letting these women sort of take up space in their situations, in their relationships, in their homeland, and sort of following them and where they go and the bad choices that they make, trying to allow them that space to do everything they needed to do on the page was really important. And I think the only way that I could sort of navigate what felt like or reach what I felt like was a true ending and sort of the right ending for the story. I think endings are really hard to nail, and I am constantly, I guess, also trying to learn how to just become a better writer and write, strong stories. But I think that so much of my process for story writing in general and endings especially has been like learning to let go and to stop trying to control so much of the narrative. Yeah.
You feel very effortless, so it's good to hear that it's difficult for you as well.
Yes.
I know you're asked often about accessibility and audience and who this is for and these great responsibilities that you've already talked about. So I want to know, what about the joy? Like, moving through this book, it's so delightful to read because I can feel the writer's delight on the page. I feel it on a line level. I feel it in the playfulness and like just the gutsiness of each story. What's been the most exciting and joyful? I know like pub week and publication, it can be scary. We've talked about this. There's lots of nerves. You're really tired. But what's the joy for you? What's been the most exciting and fun part of building these stories or building this collection? And I just want you to like take a moment to take in this too. All these people here celebrating you. We all are because you're a genius. But tell us about the joy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad you can feel the joy on the page as well. I think that's such an important part. I am one of the writers that really enjoys writing. Like that's one of the only things that I've ever wanted to do, and just having the opportunity to write a book, like I could also get very emotional and I am very tired, but it is truly like a dream come true. So I think just being able to sit with the moment and be in the moment and appreciate that, this is a dream come true. And also getting to reach Kanaka readers. And I live in Honolulu now. I was back there last week for a couple weeks ago for the book launch, and a beautiful community of Kanaka readers, not only from my family, but from just the island in general, came out, and the way that they spoke of feeling seen in the pages made me very emotional. And I think that is honestly one of the most amazing pieces of feedback and response that I could ever ask for from this book, is being seen by my community and also having my community feel seen on the page, is pretty amazing.
It is. Thank you for that, Megan. I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A. What questions do we have for Megan? Yes.
Hi, Megan.
Hi, Gabby.
So you talked about some themes that you kind of wanted to address in these stories. Are there any themes that came up, kind of like the blood, that you were surprised by and didn't expect?
So the question is about, I'm repeating for the live stream, themes, unexpected themes that came out perhaps besides the blood.
That's a good question. I think that something that came up for me in a few stories was writing into motherhood and what motherhood looks like. I think I am not a mother, and so much of my anxiety, so much of what I think about all the time is the anxieties around the question of motherhood and what it looks like to have a child and bring a child into the world. My own relationship with my mother, particularly my mother's relationship with her mother, what this, inheritance of motherhood looks like, and that really started to impress on me in writing a few of these stories. And I think that one of the stories in the collection, Mad Woman, was almost just like this cathartic experience of like writing into all of my biggest fears around motherhood. And I wouldn't say that was like an easy story to write or like a fun story to write, but it felt like a necessary, I think, story for me.
It's one of my favorites. I already told Megan this, but I was taking a swim lesson when I read that story. Yeah. There's a swim lesson in that story. I recommend every story, but that one has really stuck with me as I'm learning to swim. Yeah, hi, Anne.
Hi, Megan, congratulations.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, well, I know that you're a teacher and that also the two of you work together on No Tokens. And I wanted to ask you about how shaping other writers' writing instructs you as a writer yourself, like how that informs your own fiction.
The question is about teaching and editing, how that shapes one's own writing and fiction.
I love that question. I think one of the things that I think about so much when I'm not even when I'm teaching, but when I'm writing, I feel like I'm very hard on myself when I'm writing my own work, and when I feel like I am, and I strive to be the kind of editor and also teacher that like approaches every work with like the most generous eye, because I know that I've benefited so much from some of the most incredible teachers and editors and my that the way that I think you encounter a work, whether it be from an editing eye or as a teacher, kind of trying to steer a work or a writer in not necessarily a direction you want them to go in, but the direction that they want their work to go in, and sort of allowing their impulses to guide how you deliver feedback, how you sort of give your own impressions. That's taught me a lot. But I think just the basic like approaching a work with generosity and compassion, I don't think we always do that for our own work, and I think I think I'm just always trying to remind myself that. But yeah, I hope that answered the question.
And she really does. She's not just saying that. You're such a wise reader and like such a generous, wise, like pristine editor. But in every meeting, we'll be 2.5 hours in. Every single piece, Megan opens with, what I loved about this piece is this. What I loved about this, what I really admired is this. She opens every conversation that way. And it's really inspiring to me as an editor too. So.
Yeah.
I think you answered my question about how the Hawaiian nationality embraced your book, and I was wondering, was there any type of ceremony or offering that you gave your gods, or before you released your book, or before you knew that it was going to be released?
Is there any sort of tradition or ceremony or something that you did to kind of bring this book into the world?
Yeah, I love that question. So I think my own personal relationship with sort of Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian sort of mythology, our mo'olelo, is almost a lot more on the personal level in terms of family. So being able to celebrate with family, I might get emotional now, but my so many of these stories originated from my grams, who's my mom's mom, who passed away when I was a teenager, and she is her buried at a ceremony in the windward side of Oahu, and she was such a force and very inspiring person for me. So we did not get a chance to go before I was able to leave for this trip, but we like to go there and bring her and Papa, her husband, our flowers, and we bring our presents and sort of our, we like to just be quiet and still when we visit them. But it's a very, I think, that personal level of connecting with one's ancestors is sort of how I grew up and was raised to really cultivate respect for them. And I think that is something that we are doing when I make it home. Yeah.
Beautiful answer.
Thank you.
Yes, hi.
Hi, it's Holly Young.
Hi, Holly.
I went to college with Megan's father, so that's ages me a little bit there. You know, one of the things I like about reading is that it brings you into connection with people who aren't like you, who have different lived experiences or who have different cultures. And so for those people who don't know a lot about the history or the culture or the mythology, what would you hope for kind of, let's say, the novice reader who's kind of coming to this as a blank canvas? What would you hope to take away from this book, or what things would you like them to kind of focus on?
So the question is about other readers outside of the Kanaka or Pacific communities coming in with a blank canvas to the book. What do you hope that they take from these stories, if not all references are so familiar?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I don't see, I guess me as a reader, the way that I take in a book is sort of just experience, the experience of reading. A lot of it sort of comes and will hit me like something that I'll remember from a book or experience that I was unfamiliar with. It'll hit me later, or it'll have like a little delayed reaction for me. So I think when it comes to these stories, I don't necessarily, expect or need or want any particular audience to, come away and be like, oh, I understand this culture to, completely. I think there's always going to be a little bit of distance for people who are not, Native Hawaiian or have grown up even just in Hawaii. I think one of the most important things for me is sort of the idea of our stories having weight and having value, not in the traditional, currency sort of way, but just they have value in the world. They deserve to have space, and sort of just the fact that they Hawaiian Mo'olelo deserves to, I guess, just be known and be sort of reckoned with in a way with readers. And I think that would be really special for me, is just having readers understand that, I guess, these stories and also just all Hawaiian stories really do matter a great deal.
Is that a good stopping point? Do we have time for one more? Okay, great. Thank you for that, Megan. I was thinking too, a very quick little side note. I always go to, well, not for several years during the pandemic, but Sleepy Hollow for Halloween. Like Tarrytown has this celebration. And I'm reminded each time I go to get those tickets that Sleepy Hollow, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, was actually, it's not the legend of a town. They renamed North Tarrytown Sleepy Hollow because of a short story that was written by Washington Irving called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And because of this short story, the town has adopted it as their own kind of town lore and changed the name of the town. Wow. And I was thinking about that when I'm reading your book, because while it is so much about Mo'olelo and these familiar folktales and myths, like you're creating so many of your own in these stories, and the characters that you've created and the ideas and shapeshifting, and I'm thinking of the Mad Woman too, like they feel as real to me as the stories I grew up with now. So I think it's such a brilliant work of art, and also you're feeding that conversation as a storyteller yourself in a way that feels just really exciting to me.
Oh,
So
thank you. That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. I think I saw your hand in the back. Yeah.
Hi.
I you could say a little more about how you go story by story, you do a whole thing, just in general, how you went about it.
The question was about revision, story by story, the whole collection together. What are your revision techniques?
I love talking about vision. I won't get, I don't think too, well, no. I can talk about revision all day, because I think revision is also one of it's where so much of what I feel like the meaningful work happens for me. I write first drafts really quickly, and then I also overwrite. Like that's kind of, I have awareness of that as sort of my drafting process, and knowing that, I think I understand that a story will take a lot longer than I think it might initially take, because of the fact that a lot of my first drafts are really messy. And with revision, I spend time with just one story at a time. I usually, the way that I revise is sort of, I'll have the story on hand and close, but I won't always be looking at it closely. I like to try to write as much of a new draft as possible. Once I've kind of had some space from the draft, I'm bad at that part, the space part. Like I am very antsy and a little overeager sometimes. So I know that the space from a draft helps a lot. So I'm trying to get better about taking that time. But once I've had a story away from me for a little bit, I usually like to rewrite. I guess I think of it a lot more as rewriting than revising for a while. Like I'll rewrite a few times and sort of just follow different threads that maybe didn't necessarily speak to me in the first draft, but for whatever reason are like really creeping up and feeling important. And I do that, I think, for like a few drafts, and then I like to spend a lot of time on the line level, and then I'll print out a story and really pay attention to the language. I'll play with dialogue. I feel like I have a hard time writing dialogue, so it takes me a little bit of time, but yeah, just kind of going through drafts, paying attention to different things, and spending a decent amount of time looking at the way that sentences are brushing up against each other and what sort of emotion or sensation that's creating. Yeah, I feel like now I'm really rambling about revision, but that's a lot of my process, so yeah. I'll stop there.
Okay, one more question? Yes.
Hi, Megan.
Hi.
Lucian. Related question, I wanted to know what was the easiest story to write in this collection, and what was the hardest one?
Great. The question was, what was the easiest story to write and the most difficult story?
Yeah, T-Kira and I were talking about this at dinner the other night. I absolutely loved writing the last story in the collection, which is The Love and Decline of the Corpse Flower. And it was easy in the sense that I felt like the two characters in that story came to me almost instantly. And I don't think that's ever happened before. Like they felt so fully formed and fully lived in even just the first draft. And that felt really special. And I don't think that's ever happened before. And certainly not since. I think the hardest story to write was actually Hotel Molokai, because my Hawaiian family is from Molokai, and there was I felt a lot of pressure with that story in terms of being, aware and respectful of the family, of where we came from, while also being true to the story and the story's concerns. It was not easy, so it took me a while, and I think that I still had a lot of anxiety even around my mom reading that story. My mom reads my work, and she's a sweetie, but she absolutely loved it, and it was honestly the biggest relief, and I felt so grateful for that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. I wish we could
you.
stay here all night. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you to Kira for moderating such a wonderful conversation. And of course, thank you to Megan for celebrating this launch with us. So just a few quick reminders before we wrap up. If you are still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy of Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us here tonight, I know that many of you picked up a copy when you checked in, but if you didn't, we have a few more available for purchase at the front register. We also have a few copies of Tikira's memoir, which is fantastic, and I highly recommend checking that one out as well, also up at the front. Megan will be around to sign and personalize your books. That's going to happen at the little alcove where my coworker Jenny is now pointing to. It'll all make a little more sense in a minute, but we ask that you please grab all of your personal belongings and line up down the center aisle and curve around to the wall. Otherwise, I think that's it. Let's give these two one last round of applause. Thank you.